The video you are about to look at is from 8mm movie taken by Dan O'Toole. This first segment is the convention in 1958 in Sydney. There's the secretary of the Sydney Live Steamers, Stan McKeown. I don't know what he's going to do with the hammer there. Knock someone on the head, John, I think.
Yeah.
A few of the ladies having a morning cuppa.
You can see the dress, can't you?
Yes. And there's the steaming bays with some of the fellas already steaming up. A footbridge over the track. Incidentally, this track is at West Ryde. There's Ken Hall from Adelaide and a couple of interested young lads inside the steaming bays. That's Dan O'Toole with Ken. A New South Wales 3.5 inch 38 class. I think this locomotive in the front is Stan McKeown's locomotive, Sydney Live Steamers. There's Sess himself, one of the very keen members of the Sydney Society, with his beautifully finished locomotive. One of the other members from Sydney Live Steamers. What usually happens at a convention, the locals usually run earlier, and that gives a chance for the visitors to use the track. You'll notice the track is quite elevated. At the far end it is up nearly 8 feet, and you can see there's running boards there. If you happen to stall, you've got somewhere to rest your feet. This elevated track is 2.5 inch gauge plus 3.5 inch gauge. The Sydney Live Steamers was formed in 1946, and at this particular time we're looking at 1958, so the track is well established. They have quite an area to keep grass cut. As you can see, the grass is quite long there, and it's quite a long and big area that they have to look after. The land is actually an easement, rather a wide long easement with a big barrel drain underneath. Here we have Dan O'Toole from Geelong driving his father's Britannia class. His dad was Vin O'Toole, and I have made a terrible mistake. That is Vin himself driving the locomotive. This was their first convention, and this was a good tryout for Britannia. Vin and Dan have a track at Geelong, which ran right round their house, an elevated 3.5 inch gauge, and this was a good tryout for their locomotive. That's Sess gunning. A Sydney member, Ross Stiles. Conventions are held every Easter, They've quite organised now, and each state takes it in turn to host the convention. In this year of 2000, the convention was at Brisbane. David Hempel, a friend of the O'Toole's and a very early live steamer, driving the O'Toole's Britannia. You'll see a little bit more of David later on in the video down at Geelong. He used to visit quite regularly down there. You get a view of the height of the track there. And you can see the three rails there, 3.5 and 2.5 inch gauge. Looks like someone's run out of steam. Unfortunately, we don't have any passing loops, so the locomotives behind have to stop and wait.
Bright sunny day there.
Yes, the weather's been kind to them. We've been very lucky over the years, although I believe 2 years running, well, not 2 years running, but the time that Newcastle hosted the convention, I had a couple of washouts, and one was 2 years ago. But generally we've been very lucky being at Easter time. One young driver there driving Dad's locomotive. From the smaller tracks that we were used to down in Victoria here, it was quite an event and quite a thrill to drive on this very large, long track. It really tried the locomotives out. Just on the right there you can see a portion of the ground level track, which is 5 inch gauge. Now we're out at Luddenham. This was a parcel of land that the Sydney Society of Model and Experimental Engineers bought after selling their ground at Ashfield, and this was the first piece of track that they laid. Today you would not recognise the property. It is one of the best complexes of hobby work, live steam, model cars, indoor 00 gauge locomotives. It is a marvellous hobby club. You'll notice there was a drum behind that last carriage on that locomotive. They were bringing water up to this particular locomotive, who ran out of water. That's the no-no, John. We mustn't run out of water. But that was their first little bit of track that they laid. It's just past St Mary's, which is west of Sydney. That's Neil Campbell's locomotive, and that's Neil driving it. That particular locomotive is still running today. As we see it there, it had a steel boiler, but Neil tells me since then he's fitted a copper boiler, and it is still a remarkable locomotive for its age.
What's the advantage of copper over steel?
Cost is the main thing, John, but in the smaller gauges that doesn't really come into it, but with the bigger gauges like 7 1/4, copper's very, very expensive, and the steel's the option. Must be very careful with steel and keep an eye on corrosion inside the boiler, hence we use water treatment. That particular locomotive has an unusual valve gear called southern valve gear, and that was the first time that I'd ever seen southern valve gear in the flesh, so to speak. Neil, I understand, is living down at Goolwa in South Australia. He was a Sydney sider in those days. You can certainly see where the track in those days looked like it was out in the sticks, but it's been built up since then, John. I think this was us coming back from St Mary's or from Luddenham.
It's a good action shot.
Very good. I think he leaned right out from the carriage, John, to get that particular shot.
I think he must have.
Be careful not to lean out too far, especially in this situation. And the locomotive is one of the O'Toole's, a locomotive called Ivy Hall. It's a Great Western 460 locomotive.
Beautifully made.
Now that particular shot of that locomotive is a fellow by the name of Roger Giesecke. That's the South Australian 500 class. That particular locomotive, since Roger passed away, was donated to the Port Dock Railway Museum, and it is on display down there. This little locomotive is actually a 2.5 inch gauge locomotive. It looks like a Princess class LMS, and that's Seth McKellow's son Alan driving it. When I joined the hobby, 2.5 inch gauge was very popular, John. It's a little bit of watchmaking. I think this might be Roger Giesecke's mallet. I'm not sure of that. Roger worked at the Adelaide University, and he never publicised the fact that he was a professor, but he wasn't an absent-minded professor. He was very good with his hands, John, as you could see with that shot of his 500. There's young Tim O'Toole driving Dad around.
Father Tim.
Father Tim, that's right. That little lad now is a priest, and I believe he's shifting up to Sydney shortly too, so whether he'll visit the old track,
I bet he will.
he'll know, John. Tim was very keen, and Dad's got a watchful eye there. And we've got 3 up. Tim's still driving, and I think that's Paul, one of the other sons behind Dad.
Isn't the paintwork beautiful on them?
Yes, a lot of work in the paint.
Enamel?
Yes, and it's got to be a heat-resisting enamel, John, because of the heat of the boiler. And there's young Tim driving Mum around. Yes, the O'Tooles were very keen on their live steam. It was a particular ritual down here in Geelong. John, every Sunday morning, Vin would get the locomotive out and the local kiddies would come along for a ride. That's Roger Giesecke again with a beautiful 500.
How did they finance the track?
From the members' own contributions. Yes, you had to have a joining fee, and no doubt they were donated a lot of materials. That's Maury Turner, a prolific modeller. That particular locomotive was known as the Red Devil, and he holds the record round the O'Toole track. It's so many seconds, John, and in fact he was all wheels lifted off on one side. That's David Hempel driving the little 2.5 Princess. Maury actually is a carpenter by trade, and he has 2 fingers missing on one hand, John. So we'll see some of his handiwork later on. There's a nice shot of the Roger Giesecke's 500. Twin pumps, water feed pumps. And there's Claude Miller with his 600. As equally a good finished locomotive as the 500. They look beautiful pair of locomotives.
What's the 500 and the 600 stand for?
That's the class of the prototype locomotives on the South Australian railways. Partly finished Virginia, LBSC design. Usually at these conventions, a lot of the guys bring models that they are still building, and that creates a lot of interest because it's good to see how these locomotives come into being. There's a lot of man hours goes into them. Years, in fact, John. On the steaming bays again. This is where we raise steam. The fellow there in the middle was Murray Mitchell from Adelaide. Now there's Seth McKeown driving Ivy Hall with young Tim as fireman. Seth was a very keen model engineer and live steamer. He had a business in Sydney, and whilst coming down to Melbourne on business, he always came and stayed at the O'Toole's, and we used to have some real sessions at night, John, discussing the intricacies of model engineering and live steam in particular. I think that blue locomotive is Murray Mitchell's Britannia. The green one in the rear there is another LBSC design. You can see the other locomotive unpainted. It's a terrible job to have to dismantle everything to paint it, John. It's nearly as bad as building the locomotive. Here we have one of Stephenson's rocket, so they can get down very, very small. Just a general view of the logos on the steaming bays. There's a shot of some of the interstate visitors. We can see the turntable in operation here, and we're about to see a little bit of remote control, John. Fellow showing the movie camera is a fellow by the name of Bert Kirby from Melbourne. That's
radio controlled.
Yes.
It's coming out very clear for an 8mm movie.
Yes, it has, John, considering we're looking back at 1958. It's excellent.
And the grain in the 8mm wasn't as good as 16.
Okay, yes. That's an LBSC Maisie. LBSC was a designer of these small locomotives who was able to write the articles for the non-engineer John, like the likes of myself. He would literally take us by the hand and lead us through the intricacies of building a live steam locomotive. Looks like young Tim is the waterman there.
I wonder if he ever preaches his interest.
He's still keen on it, John. Usually when he comes down to Geelong, Dan usually fires up one of the locomotives for Tim to drive. There's Ross Stiles with that beautifully finished locomotive.
You should get some digital video pictures one day.
Yes,
If it came off there.
yes, it's quite a telephoto. What do they call it? Photographic. It shows up all the bumps and hollows. Now we have a little bit of a mishap here. Dan was at the right spot at the right time. You can see the height that the locomotive fell off. Luckily it fell into soft ground with no damage and certainly no injury to the driver. Now here we are down at the O'Toole's track in Geelong, firing up Britannia. I'll just point out, John, you'll notice that the track is very high there. It has quite high posts there.
Yes.
Later on they lowered it at the back of the house to give it a little bit of gradient, and they discovered this after being to Sydney, that it puts a little bit thinking for the driver to fire accordingly to the gradients. So in later years they did lower the track at the back. That's Dan driving Britannia again. This is just a 1 gauge track, 3.5 inch, and there's parts of it removable for access to the front door and clothesline. Here we are at Surrey Hills Live Steamers, which I consider we'd call the base of live steam in those days in Geelong, in Victoria. The curves are fairly sharp there, and you'll notice that that particular locomotive had his front bogie off to negotiate the turns. Here we have David Hempel again at Surrey Hills with his beautiful S-Class Pacific locomotive.
The spirit of progress.
And that's what it's modelled on, John. The old steam spirit of progress. That's Wilf Atkinson with his beam engine.
The governors.
Yes. There's a little motorised locomotive built by Bill Newman. Bill was a prolific builder. He named all his locomotives Blue Bottle, and we'll see some of them running down in Geelong in another segment here. There's Vin of a Sunday morning and young Tim getting ready to fire up. The boys, the gangers, checking the track out. You'll notice a vacuum cleaner there. That's used to raise steam to give us a forced draft through the firebox and fire tubes until a little bit of pressure is built up, and then a little steam blower is then turned on to maintain the fire. Otherwise it would go out. There's Grandad with driver Tim and Paul on the back. As I said before, John, this was quite a ritual with Vin of a Sunday morning.
interstate programs and conventions are regular, are they?
Yes, every Easter now, John. Some of the clubs do have all-comers runs. In fact, shortly there'll be one at Wagga Wagga. We now currently have about 70 clubs scattered through Australia in all capital cities, major cities, plus a lot of country towns. The hobby has certainly grown from these days back in the early 50s and early 60s. There's a nice shot of the motion.
Beautiful. How did they pin the rails down?
There's a cross tie and then a hook that bolts through the cross tie. This is just a little interlude here. This is the Geelong City Council's roller going to the wreckers. And it ran out of water there, and Dan was just happened to be driving by, so he stopped the car and took a shot of this. Little did he know that just as it turned into Latrobe Terrace, it blew a tube and then had to get towed up to Albert Batty's, I think it was, John, the scrap metal agent in Geelong.
It's a fine shot, isn't it?
Yes, he was just in the right spot at the right time. Now we're back at O'Toole's, and this is what we call a run day. At that stage we had no actual club track as such in Victoria, and various private tracks used to host the club days. Bill Troughton with his Maisie. Bill is a great model little engineer from Ballarat. He has his own track around his workshop. Our secretary of the Surrey Hills Live Steamers, Stan Milligan, at the throttle. Just a general view of visitors and friends. The fellow with the suit on was a prolific builder of live steam as well. Now we're down at Seaford at Freddie Pascoe's track. This was another track where we'd have our club run days. Beautiful setting, as you can see, John. Unfortunately, it's very treed there, and it's a bit hard to get really good shots with the 8mm, but it just gives us an idea of the track down at Seaford. It's Bill Thomas. This locomotive is one of Fred's, called General Smuts. It was I think a 6 1/4 inch gauge locomotive, which was not a standard scale, and Fred put in the rail to run that locomotive. A beautiful locomotive it is, as you can see by the size of it. That's Clary Hall. Well, I think with his brother's locomotive, Ken's locomotive. A bit of a smoky one, John. Another shot of General Smuts. It's based on a South African locomotive. Quite a load on.